By the time I turned 35, love no longer felt like hope. It felt like a pattern I couldn't break, no matter how carefully I tried to do everything right. 5 heartbreaks in 3 years. Not misunderstandings. Not relationships that simply faded. Real commitments. Real promises. Real endings that left scars I carried quietly, even when no one noticed. From the outside, my life looked stable. I lived alone in a small, organized apartment. I worked in the administrative department of a large hospital, handling schedules, reports, policies, everything that kept the place running smoothly but never earned recognition. I was dependable, efficient, invisible. I smiled at coworkers in the hallways, exchanged polite greetings, and avoided conversations that went beyond surface-level kindness. Most days, I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance. The last man I loved was the one I believed would finally change everything. We were together for almost 2 years, long enough to meet families, to spend holidays together, to talk seriously about marriage. I let myself imagine a future that didn't involve starting over again. For the first time in a long while, I felt chosen. That sense of safety disappeared slowly at first. He began working late more often. Messages went unanswered for hours. When I asked if something was wrong, he smiled and told me I was worrying too much. I wanted to believe him. After so many disappointments, I told myself that trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt. The truth came out on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you never expect to remember forever. He wasn't just cheating. He was cheating with a woman from the hospital, a colleague, someone who had sat with me during breaks, who listened when I vented about my relationship, who hugged me and said I deserved better. She called herself my friend. What hurt even more than the betrayal was how openly it became public. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She talked about it freely, as if it were an accomplishment. By the following Monday, the entire hospital knew. I felt it in the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, in the glances that lingered just a second too long, in the forced sympathy mixed with curiosity. I stopped going to the cafeteria. I started eating alone in empty offices or skipping meals entirely. At night, I went home exhausted in a way that sleep never seemed to fix. When he begged for forgiveness, I almost agreed. Not because I trusted him, but because I was desperate for the pain to stop. Then I realized forgiveness wouldn't give me back my dignity. It wouldn't erase the humiliation. That was when I booked the cruise. I didn't tell anyone. No posts, no announcements. I just needed distance. 3 days at sea, followed by a tourist city where no one knew my name or my story. I told myself I wasn't running away. I was choosing myself. I packed 1 suitcase, locked my apartment door, and left without looking back. Boarding the ship felt strange. I was surrounded by couples laughing, families taking photos, people celebrating anniversaries and honeymoons. I reminded myself that I didn't need any of that. I was there for peace, not romance. That first night, I stood alone on the deck, watching the ocean stretch endlessly in front of me. The sound of the water was calming, almost hypnotic. For the first time in months, my thoughts slowed down. I believed I was finally okay. That illusion didn't last long. The next morning, the lights flickered and then went out completely. At first, people laughed, assuming it was a temporary issue. Minutes passed, then an hour. The air conditioning stopped. Elevators shut down. The ship began to feel smaller, heavier. When the announcement finally came, the tone was calm, but the message wasn't. A serious power failure. We were stranded in open sea. 3 days became 4, then 5. Conditions deteriorated quickly. Limited food, no hot water. Tempers flared. People argued over nothing. Some cried openly, overwhelmed by fear and frustration. The cruise that was meant to be an escape became something else entirely, a test of patience, of endurance. That was when I saw him, my ex's older brother. I recognized him immediately, and my stomach tightened. We had crossed paths before at family gatherings. Polite conversations, nothing more. I never liked him, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was connected to. Seeing him there felt like the universe mocking me. Of course, we had booked the same package. Same dining schedule, same activities, same narrow corridors. We kept running into each other over and over again. At first, we avoided eye contact. Then avoiding became impossible. With the elevators down, people gathered on the decks for air. The heat was unbearable. He approached once, holding a bottle of water. I shook my head and turned away. The second time, I accepted it without looking at him. By the third encounter, silence felt heavier than words. "This isn't exactly the vacation you planned," he said quietly. I shrugged, unsure of how to respond. That night, under a dark sky filled with unfamiliar stars, he asked a simple question. "Are you okay?" I almost laughed. Instead, I told the truth. Not details. Just the weight of everything I had been carrying. The exhaustion. The disappointment. The feeling that I was always starting over while everyone else seemed to move forward. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend his brother. He just listened. Then he shared his own story. Failed relationships. A breakup a year earlier that left him questioning his choices. And why he was on that cruise at all. He had quit his job in fuel sales after realizing his company was crossing ethical lines. He walked away without a backup plan, choosing principles over comfort. That didn't fit the image I had built of him. The ship remained stalled, but something inside me had begun to shift. After that night, something between us quietly shifted. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that was impossible to ignore once it existed. We didn't suddenly become close, and we certainly didn't pretend the situation wasn't complicated, but the awkward tension that had surrounded our earlier encounters softened into something more manageable, more human. The ship was still without full power, and daily life had become a strange routine built around inconvenience. People lined up early for food. Tempers flared over small things. Complaints echoed through the corridors. Yet somehow, my conversations with him became the most stable part of those days. We talked while sitting on the deck, while waiting in lines, while watching the horizon stretch endlessly in front of us. Nothing dramatic. Just honesty, offered without expectation. I remained cautious. Every instinct I had learned over the past years told me to stay guarded. I reminded myself repeatedly who he was connected to. I told myself that familiarity could be misleading, that kindness didn't automatically mean safety. Still, I couldn't ignore the contrast between the man in front of me and the one who had hurt me so deeply. I began noticing things I hadn't intended to. The way he spoke calmly even when others raised their voices. The way he stepped aside to let elderly passengers sit. The way he never tried to fill silence when it didn't need words. Those details didn't feel performative. They felt consistent, and consistency had become something I trusted more than promises. One afternoon, as we sat together watching the ocean, I finally asked why he hadn't defended his brother when I talked about the betrayal. The question had been sitting in my chest for days. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the water for a long moment before saying that love didn't excuse harm and loyalty didn't require blindness. He said he had warned his brother more than once, and that some choices didn't deserve protection. That honesty unsettled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Part of me wanted him to minimize it, to soften the truth. Instead, he named it clearly. That made it harder to dismiss him as someone acting out of convenience. The nights were the hardest. Without air conditioning, sleep came in fragments. The heat clung to everything. People wandered the decks late into the night, restless and irritable. On one of those nights, we talked about loneliness. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet version that settles into your life when disappointment becomes familiar. He admitted that after his last relationship ended, he questioned whether he was capable of choosing the right people at all. I admitted that I felt like I was always the one who loved more. There was no attempt to fix each other, no advice, just recognition. And that recognition felt grounding. When the announcement finally came that we would reach the tourist city 2 days later than planned, relief spread through the ship, slowly, cautiously. People were exhausted, emotionally and physically. Stepping onto solid ground felt surreal, like waking up from a long, uncomfortable dream. The air felt lighter, the sounds sharper. For the first time in days, my shoulders relaxed. The 3 days in the city unfolded without urgency. We didn't make elaborate plans. We walked aimlessly through streets filled with unfamiliar languages and music. We sat in small cafes, watching strangers pass by, sharing stories that had nothing to do with pain or disappointment. It felt like borrowing someone else's life for a moment, one where my past didn't exist. Even then, I kept reminding myself that this was temporary. A pause, not a new beginning. I told him as much one afternoon, explaining that I wasn't ready to entangle myself with anyone connected to my past. The words came out carefully, measured. He listened without interrupting, and told me he understood. He said he wasn't expecting anything, and that he respected my boundaries. That response disarmed me more than any declaration could have. On the last evening in the city, we walked along the waterfront as the sun disappeared behind the buildings. The silence stretched between us, heavy with things neither of us seemed ready to say. When he reached for my hand, the gesture was slow, almost hesitant, as if he was prepared for me to pull away. I didn't. That moment felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already happened. Returning to the ship brought reality back into focus. The power had been partially restored, but the sense of isolation remained. Knowing the trip was coming to an end filled me with an unexpected mix of relief and reluctance. I had grown used to this suspended version of life, where nothing was demanded of me beyond being present. On the final night before the ship docked for good, he asked if we could talk. His voice carried a seriousness that made my stomach tighten. I recognized that feeling immediately. It was the same one that had preceded bad news so many times before. We found a quiet corner on the deck, away from the remaining crowd. He told me there was something I needed to know before anything continued between us. I asked him to be honest, bracing myself for disappointment. He took a deep breath and said he hadn't been on that cruise by coincidence. He already knew me, not just from our brief interactions in the past. His brother talked about me often, about my dedication, my loyalty, the way I gave myself fully to the people I loved. He said he had warned his brother that he was risking losing the most incredible woman he would ever meet. When the betrayal happened, he wasn't shocked, only deeply disappointed. When he heard about the cruise, something inside him shifted. He realized he had feelings he had never allowed himself to examine. Not sudden, not impulsive, but built quietly over time. He bought the ticket without knowing if he would even speak to me, without expectations, just a need to be there. I didn't respond right away. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Part of me felt seen in a way I hadn't before. Another part felt exposed, uncertain whether this revelation was romantic or unsettling. The night ended without resolution, leaving me alone with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I didn't answer him that night, or the morning after, or the day that followed. When the ship finally docked and everyone rushed to disembark, I moved through the crowd on autopilot, carrying my suitcase and a storm of thoughts I couldn't organize. The confession replayed in my head over and over, each time landing differently. Sometimes it felt tender, almost inevitable. Other times it felt intrusive, as if I had been observed without consent. Back home, routine tried to reassert itself. The familiar drive to work, the badge scan at the hospital entrance, the steady hum of activity that never really stopped. On the surface, everything looked the same. Inside, nothing was settled. I avoided his messages, not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to respond without clarity. I needed time to understand whether what I felt was genuine connection or simply relief after prolonged pain. At night, lying in bed, I replayed the months before the cruise, the betrayal, the humiliation, the way my confidence had quietly eroded until I barely recognized myself. I wondered if I was reaching for safety in the first place it seemed available. I wondered if I was mistaking kindness for destiny. I had done that before. I couldn't afford to do it again. 3 days passed like that. On the third evening, I realized something that startled me. Despite the confusion, despite the fear, I didn't feel pressure. He hadn't demanded answers. He hadn't sent long explanations or emotional appeals. He had given me space. That detail mattered more than any romantic gesture ever could. That night, I sent a message suggesting we meet for coffee near the hospital. Neutral ground, daylight, a place where I felt anchored. When he walked in, I saw the tension in his shoulders immediately. He looked like someone bracing for rejection, prepared to explain himself one more time if given the chance. Before he could speak, I asked him to sit. I told him I needed to talk first. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. I told him that the cruise had forced me to confront parts of myself I had been avoiding, that I had spent years believing love was something that inevitably ended in disappointment, and that belief had shaped how I moved through the world. I told him his confession scared me, not because of his intentions, but because it challenged the walls I had built so deliberately. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady but open. When I finished, I told him the truth. If he had really chosen to be there without expecting anything in return, if he had respected my space even when it would have been easier not to, then that said more about his character than anything else ever could. I told him I wasn't ready to promise certainty, but I was willing to explore what this could be without fear leading the way. The relief on his face was subtle, but unmistakable. We took things slowly after that, deliberately. We met for coffee, then dinner, then walks that stretched longer than planned. There was no rush to define what we were. Instead, we focused on how we treated each other, how disagreements were handled, how silence was respected, how vulnerability was met with care rather than control. Returning to work remained challenging. The hospital carried memories I couldn't erase. Some days were easier than others. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of my past in places I didn't expect. A familiar laugh down the hallway. A name mentioned casually in conversation. Each time, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. But those reactions softened with time. They no longer dictated my behavior. He never pushed me to confront anything before I was ready. When I spoke about the humiliation I had felt, he didn't offer empty reassurance. He acknowledged the damage honestly, without minimizing it. That honesty allowed me to process things at my own pace, rather than rushing toward artificial closure. Months passed quietly. The relationship deepened not through grand declarations, but through consistency, through showing up when promised, through difficult conversations that didn't end in emotional withdrawal, through laughter that felt unforced. I noticed changes in myself that had nothing to do with him directly. I slept better. I spoke more confidently in meetings. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. One evening, we ran into my ex unexpectedly at a grocery store. The encounter lasted less than a minute, but it felt significant. My ex looked uncomfortable, unsure how to engage. I felt calm. Later, I realized that indifference had replaced anger. That shift felt like reclaiming something I thought I had lost permanently. When I told him about it, he asked how I felt. I searched for the right word and settled on something simple. Free. Not because the past no longer existed, but because it no longer defined me. He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, not as a single decision, but as a series of moments that aligned. When he said he would call, he did. When plans changed, he explained why. When conflict arose, it was addressed rather than avoided. Each of those moments added weight to something solid, something I hadn't experienced before. The first time he told me he loved me, it wasn't planned. We were cooking together, navigating a cramped kitchen and laughing at a minor disaster with a pan. He said it simply, without ceremony, as if it were an observation rather than a demand. I froze, not because I didn't feel it, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way that scared me. When I finally said it back, my voice shook. He smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet understanding. Loving him didn't erase my past. It didn't make me immune to fear, but it changed how I related to both. I stopped viewing vulnerability as weakness. I stopped equating peace with boredom. I learned that safety could coexist with depth, and that intensity didn't have to mean instability. Sometimes I thought back to the cruise, to the heat, the darkness, the frustration, to how trapped I had felt, convinced that the universe was punishing me one last time. I couldn't have imagined then that the very situation I resented would become the turning point I needed. I didn't believe everything happened for a reason, but I believed we found meaning when we were ready to see it. And sometimes, the path forward didn't look like healing at first. Sometimes, it looked like inconvenience, like discomfort, like a ship stalled in the middle of the ocean, forcing you to sit with yourself long enough to change. As time went on, I became more aware of how deeply the past had shaped my expectations. Even in moments of happiness, there was a quiet voice in the back of my mind, waiting for the ground to shift beneath my feet. I didn't tell him that right away. I didn't want to turn my fears into a prophecy. Instead, I paid attention to what was actually happening, not what I was afraid might happen. He continued to show up in ways that felt steady, rather than dramatic. There were no grand gestures meant to impress me, no attempts to rush milestones. When I had a difficult day at work, he listened without trying to fix it. When I withdrew emotionally, he noticed but didn't punish me for it. He gave me space without disappearing, and presence without pressure. That balance was new to me. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day at the hospital, I realized I was no longer carrying the weight alone. Not because he had taken it from me, but because I had stopped insisting on carrying everything by myself. That realization felt both comforting and unsettling. Independence had been my armor for so long that learning how to share responsibility felt like learning a new language. We talked about boundaries openly, about what we needed, what we feared, what we weren't ready for yet. Those conversations weren't always easy. Sometimes they were uncomfortable, forcing us to confront assumptions we didn't realize we were making. But they never felt destructive. Each one brought clarity rather than distance. At some point, I noticed that my apartment no longer felt like a place I hid in. It felt like a home again. I opened the curtains more often. I cooked real meals instead of reheating whatever was easiest. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary moments that no longer felt heavy. There were still triggers. Certain songs, certain places. Occasionally, a comment from a coworker would pull me back into memories I didn't ask for. But those moments passed more quickly now. They no longer consumed entire days. I learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering without reliving. Meeting his family was something I approached cautiously. I didn't want to step into a space where old dynamics might resurface unexpectedly. When it finally happened, it was simpler than I imagined. Polite conversations, neutral ground. No comparisons, no tension. I realized then that the fear I carried was often louder than reality itself. One evening, Months into our relationship, he asked me if I believed in forgiveness. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told him I believed forgiveness was less about excusing what happened and more about releasing the hold it had on you. I wasn't sure I had fully forgiven everyone involved in my past, but I knew I no longer wanted to live defined by it. He nodded, as if that answer made sense to him. There was no pressure to go further, no expectation of closure on his terms. That respect reinforced something I was still learning to trust. The moment I realized I loved him wasn't marked by intensity or urgency. It happened quietly, during an ordinary evening when nothing remarkable was happening at all. I looked at him and felt a sense of calm that didn't depend on reassurance or validation. It wasn't the rush I had once mistaken for passion. It was something steadier, deeper, something that didn't demand proof. When we talked about the future, it no longer felt like tempting fate. We didn't make promises we couldn't keep. We spoke in possibilities rather than guarantees. That felt honest. It felt sustainable. For the first time, imagining what came next didn't fill me with anxiety. There was a day, almost a year after the cruise, when I walked past the harbor without realizing where I was until I smelled the ocean. The memory hit me suddenly. The heat, the darkness, the frustration of being stuck with no control over what would happen next. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me. That was when I understood how much had changed. What once felt like the worst possible detour of my life had quietly redirected everything. I didn't romanticize the pain that led me there. I didn't feel grateful for the betrayal or the humiliation, but I acknowledged the clarity they forced on me. They showed me what I would no longer accept. They stripped away illusions I had been clinging to out of fear of being alone. Love, I realized, wasn't supposed to feel like a test you were constantly failing. It wasn't meant to shrink you or keep you guessing. It wasn't something you had to earn by enduring disappointment. Real love didn't arrive with chaos. It arrived with consistency. I used to believe that strength meant surviving on your own, no matter the cost. Now I understood that strength could also mean allowing yourself to be seen, choosing connection even when vulnerability felt risky, not blindly, not desperately, but consciously. If someone had told me, when I booked that cruise, that my life was about to change in a way I couldn't imagine, I wouldn't have believed them. I was too focused on escaping the pain to consider the possibility of something new waiting on the other side of it. What I know now is simple. I didn't find love by chasing it. I found it by facing what I had been running from, by sitting with discomfort long enough to understand myself better, by choosing honesty over fear, even when it felt safer to stay guarded. The ocean didn't heal me. Time alone didn't heal me. What healed me was learning to trust myself again, and recognizing someone who deserved that trust when he appeared in the most unexpected place. Sometimes life doesn't give you the fresh start you ask for. Sometimes it gives you the one you need. And that, I finally understood, was enough.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.